Chapter 2. The Old Before and Hereafter. Polly was the first person awake in her room, mentally preparing herself for the day ahead of her. Without meaning to, she had already memorized her schedule from the first glance, so she began to compartmentalize what she could to do to make sure that her first official day went as smoothly as possible. First and foremost, she wanted to talk to Marco. It had become part of her daily routine when they were roommates, and she knew that it was one of the only ways to settle her nerves that were curling in her gut. After that, she wasn't sure what she needed to do, feeling like she was flying blind in the new territory. She'd scoured the internet for years for interviews, articles, and any other form of media from previous academy students about what their year was like, taking every word to heart as she tried to imagine herself in the same scenario. Now it felt like she had spent years studying for a test, only for it to not cover a single topic she focused on, but she was going to do her best. She forced herself to stand and stretch, to act like it was just another morning, and she smiled at her roommates. Excited, Wyatt asked them as he stood in front of the full-body mirror that one of them had brought, fixing his dirty blonde hair into something presentable. He got a cheer from Penny, who was charging her phone, and a clap or two from Blake, who was brushing his teeth in their connected bathroom. "Big day ahead, huh?" Polly tried to chime in, but even to her own ears, the enthusiastic voice sounded forced. She caught the worried glance from Wyatt from his reflection, but she quickly dropped the eye contact. Instead, she busied herself with looking over the schedule she was given, as if it somehow magically changed from the night before. "Do you guys know anyone else in our classes?" Penny asked after a moment, receiving a head shake from both of the boys. "I know a guy in the strength track, so sadly, I'll be leaving you all to your own devices for breakfast." "Boo," Blake jeered as he re-entered the main room, faux frown on his face as he shrugged on a hoodie. "So it's just us three then?" "You two, actually," Polly chimed in with an apologetic smile. "I'll be eating with my friend. We've known each other for forever." She didn't know why it felt necessary to tag on the last comment, but it felt important to her that they knew it. She earned herself a half-hearted glare from Blake, who dramatically cried about how lonely he and Wyatt were going to be. "What track is your friend in?" Penny asked, looking genuinely curious in what she was asking. Polly opened her mouth, but immediately shut it, pausing for her answer. Normally, it would have been an easy response to give, the truth of the perception track being on the tip of her tongue, but she stopped herself. Marco had yet to tell her why he had lied about his track, and while she was deathly curious as to his reasoning, she knew she had to trust her friend. So she recovered herself quickly, masking her pause with a fake cough, and plastering on the most convincing smile she could. "He's also in strength," she replied cheerily, watching as Penny's face lit up none the wiser. The group of them made their way out of the room, and Polly chose to ignore the guilt in her stomach as she walked the hallway towards the elevator. The four of them descended to one of the lower floors, the doors sliding open to reveal a dining hall that was packed with students. It was almost deafening with the crowds packed around the tables, chatting about their first night with their friends at an uncontrolled volume. It was loud enough to make Polly wince, so she couldn't imagine what it felt like with those with heightened senses. She walked through the line with her roommates to get food, but her stomach turned with nerves, making everything look nauseating or unappetizing. She settled on simple avocado toast, making her way through the rest of the line with ease, scanning the cafeteria in search of her friend. She found him lingering to the side of the crowd, tray of his own in his hand as his eyes looked glazed over and unfocused. She frowned to herself, trying to make herself visible as she approached, but he showed no signs of acknowledging her. She gently bumped her shoulder into his, watching as he startled for a moment, head whipping around at lightning speed to meet her face. His muscles relaxed once he saw that it was her, and Polly masked her unease with a careful smile. "It's too loud in here," she commented, as if it were bothering her more than him. "Let's find somewhere quiet to eat." He didn't verbalize his agreement, only nodding as he followed her out of the room and into the stairwell. Polly blindly led them up a few levels, with no particular destination in mind, and picked one of the stairs on the 5th floor to sit on. She motioned to the platform that was above her step, and Marco silently sat down, back resting against the wall as he was parallel to where she was. "Rough night?" she asked. He sighed with something unspoken and heavy, nodding as he reached for one of the slices of toast that was placed onto his plate. It was plain, just the way Marco had always made it. "Couldn't sleep," he answered simply. "Insomnia." She winced sympathetically, noting the heavy eye bags that were almost as deep as bruises on his face. She bit back a comment about relating to the nerves for their day ahead, but they both knew that wasn't what he was talking about. Marco had royally messed up his sleep schedule when he went patrolling in the moors late at night, looking for a fight wherever he could find one, and it left him living like a third-shift worker, functioning off of the caffeine of coffee. "How was your first night with your roommates?" She diverted instead, not wanting to think about the existence of fisticuff for longer than she'd like to. Immediately, she could see that she had somehow misspoken again when Marco let out a humorous laugh. "Well," he started. "I didn't even tell them my name, so that's a start," she snorted. "Yeah, mine had some sort of bet about how lame my powers would be. It led to a whole exchange involving $20 until they decided I was at least relatively cool, I think." "So we're really batting 1,000, Marco commented sarcastically, shaking his head at the mess the two of them were. He seemed to relax more during their conversation, but not completely, as they continued to eat their small breakfasts in silence that was foreign. Polly waited for a while to see if Marco would engage in a new topic, start a conversation on his own, but he remained quiet. Small portions of frustration bloomed in her chest. It wasn't that she was mad at Marco, who was obviously stressed, but over the fact that he was clearly hiding something from her. He was allowed to keep secrets, because they didn't need to tell each other everything, but it was clear that whatever was on his mind involved Polly in some capacity. He wouldn't look at her in the eyes, at least not for more than a few seconds, and he always seemed to be choosing his words carefully on the rare occasions that he did decide to speak. He trusted Polly, which he'd made clear throughout their years of friendship, but it was something different now. It felt like unwarranted protection. To anyone else, it might have seemed sweet to see him try and keep her out of trouble, but the two of them had been down the path before. It wasn't about his trust in Polly, but his faith in her abilities. He never made her feel weak or lame about being able to do what she could do, but it was clear that he didn't believe she could take care of herself if something went wrong. It was a long, screaming match between the two of them when it came to a head. They were both hurt by the other, shouting insults that they didn't mean just to try and drive the other away, because it's all they knew how to do. Marco telling her that she wasn't cut out for the big leagues to be a hero, and Polly shooting back that neither was he, playing pretend out in the moors every night to try and prove a moot point. Neither of them were proud of what they said, and many tearful apologies were given, but they both knew that they still remembered that night. All Polly wanted was to know what Marco was doing each night that he went out as fisticuff, because he kept the identity on lockdown when he came back to the apartment each night. A new cut, a new bruise, or some haunting look on his face of a new memory that would linger with him for days, and each time Polly had been there for him. She knew logically that Marco didn't owe her anything, that she'd patch him up even if she didn't care for him the way that she did, but there was something about being kept in the dark that made her worry. Vigilantes weren't as common in the Desher district like they were in the moors, so growing up she never really put too much thought into what the term meant. While heroes weren't exactly common there either, she still couldn't help but fantasize what it would mean to wear one of the armored suits and save the day against the villains. She had seen the damages that both parties caused in the sake of doing the right thing, and she agreed that they should be held responsible for it. Issuing license made the most sense, and she could see why the heroes weren't fond of the vigilantes who refused to get one. If they were destroying buildings or hurting people in their fights, there was no way to hold them accountable since most of them remained anonymous anyway. She knew that Marco had the best of intentions when he fought as fisticuff, but Polly couldn't be confident in saying the same when it came to the other vigilantes in the city. So, on the night of their major fight, she insisted to know what really went down when he went on patrols. When he refused to tell her, it felt like he was trying to keep her in the dark about something so simple. Marco would shoulder the weight of the world for those he cared about, Polly being included, but she loudly reminded him then he didn't have to. Powers be damned, Marco was as much Polly's to protect as she was his. They moved past it, licking their wounds and then apologizing to one another, and they never spoke about it again. Sitting on the stairwell between the 5th and 6th floor, Polly felt a sense of deja vu when she looked at Marco. He was trying to be the bigger person, the great protector he lived to be, but all Polly saw was a stubborn fool refusing help. She sighed something heavy, leaning her head back until it hit the wall behind her, and counted down the minutes in her head. "We should probably start heading to our classes," Marco commented after she reached the 5-minute mark. She could only nod in agreement, taking the offered hand that helped her stand, and slowly began to make their descent. They returned to the cafeteria, Polly looking for at least one of her roommates so that she wasn't wandering the building alone and risking getting lost. She couldn't see either of the boys immediately, but she spotted Penny talking to a boy with platinum hair, and Polly pointed him out to Marco so that he could eventually put a face to a name. "You've got to be kidding me," she heard him mutter under his breath, quiet enough that Polly knew he thought that she couldn't hear him. Before she could retort, she felt him put a hand on her shoulder, gently guiding her to the side by a couple steps, out of the way of a few people who walked past. She startled when another arm landed on her shoulder, tugging back to the other direction and away from Marco. "Hey, Rumi, we've got to get going," Blake's cheery voice loudly called from beside her, the hand on her shoulder squeezing gently. She could only stutter out a confused noise, subtly shifting herself out of his hold as she shot an exasperated look to Marco. "I'll see you after class," she told him as Blake continued to guide her away to the elevator, pressing the button for one of the higher floors multiple times until the doors closed. "You cannot be seen talking to him," Blake said once the elevator began to rise. "And why the hell not?" Polly demanded, a hot coal of anger taking root in her chest. She could see herself being friends with Blake once she got to know him better, but there would never be a world where anyone could tell her that she couldn't talk with Marco. "Look, I don't have a problem with the guy. He seems nice enough, but not everybody here sees him that way," Blake told her with a frown. "Ultimatum students sort of have a bad rep around here nowadays." "What are you talking about?" she asked impatiently, the word ultimatum sticking out like a red flag in her mind. Blake looked at her for a moment, like he was trying to gauge if she was joking or not. When he determined that she was not, he let out a heavy sigh, running his hands over his face. "Ultimatums are when the Federation gives vigilantes the choice between getting their license or being arrested," he put it simply. While I and the other students might not know exactly which vigilante he was, word spreads quickly that he was one, and a lot of people here aren't exactly fond of the idea. Polly thought back to the night that Marco brought up applying to the academy, and how there was zero mention of running into any heroes in the moors that night. "Nothing happened," Marco had told her then. "I thought it would be the better option considering the hero patrols that are happening more frequently in the moors." So while it wasn't a lie, it wasn't the truth either. "Why does that matter if he's enrolled as a student now? And what does that have to do with me?" she asked, arms firmly crossed over her chest. The elevator doors chimed, reaching the floor of their first class, and Blake lowered his voice as he stepped out into the hallway. "Because there are a lot of people here who are raised in districts like Creo and Feodus, who will always side with Federation, and if the Federation dislikes vigilantes..." He drifted off with a sigh, shaking his head as he looked Polly in the eye with the most sincerity she had ever seen the boy have since the short time she'd known him. "All I know is that it's social suicide being seen talking to him, so just be careful. I'm just trying to look out for you," he told her, grimacing as Polly scoffed. "I'm so over everyone telling me what to do because they want to protect me," she hissed out, pushing past Blake with a huff. She could feel her own nose twitch with irritation, a sneeze building in the back of her nostrils like it always seemed to get when she got emotional. She hated it, so she fought against the urge, keeping her abilities in check as she approached the gymnasium doors. She didn't think about Marco and his lies, about Blake and his terrible advice, and took a deep, steadying breath. At the moment, all she had to do was walk into training and hope she won't make a fool of herself in front of her fellow students and mentors. All she had to do was use her head, stay calm, and present herself like she always belonged there. She plastered a smile onto her face as she pushed the heavy door open, walking into the training room to begin her first step of becoming an actual, real-life superhero. Contrary to popular belief, Marco actually enjoyed being in the classroom. Most of the time, there was no side conversations other than the occasional whisper between classmates, and it was relatively quiet during lectures that gave his hearing a break. He liked learning, gaining new information to add to his ammunition of knowledge, and use in his real life both with and without the mask. He wasn't exactly excited by the fact that the class was taking place at the Federation, being taught by Symphony, but since it wasn't too far off from his history class back in high school, he couldn't complain much. While there was always a full unit that covered the founding of the Federation, it seemed like they wanted to go more in depth from how they turned from a simple support group into an organization of superheroes. In the year 1961, original Federation founders Elizabeth Wendell and Thomas Felhart united a group of unlikely people to create safe havens for those with the newest mutations, also known as abilities, Symphony explained, shifting the projector's slide to show an old photograph of the two aforementioned people. Stained with the yellow tint of old age, the copy of the Polaroid showed a man with long auburn hair sitting next to a blonde woman, both wearing serious expressions as their attention was fixed elsewhere. Everyone knew Wendell and Fellhart, the two people born with a dream to make the lives of those with abilities better than they were when they first were discovered. Originally referred to as mutations, people's abilities began to emerge after the Second World War, when soldiers and common folks alike began to work with materials they didn't know the consequences to. Like most times when humanity was presented with an idea they didn't know about, or knew how to control, they feared it. For many years after the war, those who were affected by the mutation were hated. Labeled as monsters, there was nowhere for them to go in humanity with their new abilities they were cursed with. Until Elizabeth Wendell and Thomas Fellhart. They were the main contributors to building the safe havens that would later be known as the Federation for those with abilities. While the names of the other original founders were muddled and lost in history, the two of them were credited for the main discovery of the place. They also had one thing that made them stand out from the rest of their team of original founders. Out of the 5 of them, Wendell and Fellhart had abilities themselves. Elizabeth's abilities were ones that were rare even in modern day, falling into the mind track if the title existed back then. She couldn't read minds or control them, but she had prophetic dreams about the future, of course limited to the knowledge, and change it however she could. Because of it, many people back then hated her more than they feared her. If she could see bad things coming, then why didn't she stop them? Sources cite that Wendell's abilities were cryptic, and that her visions weren't as black and white as many once assumed, Symphony continued, pointing to the blonde woman in the brown dress. She looked respectable, Marco thought to himself, though she had everything under control to the best of her abilities. Standing next to her with long auburn hair and a full beard to match was Thomas Fellhart. Sharing a track with Marco, he supposedly could feel incoming danger like a sixth sense, which was illogical considering that Fellhart was a former soldier in the war. He stood next to Elizabeth with the same serious expression, focused on something else in the distance, with his notorious cane clutched in his right hand. An old injury from his time serving, a metallic raven's head carved into the grip. Before the public knew them as Wendell and Fellhart, they were known as Extrasensory and the Oracle, respectively, Symphony explained, placing a picture of just Elizabeth speaking at a podium. It was agreed that they take on the aliases to protect not only themselves from harm, but their families as well. This is why we have our hero titles today. The sound of pens meeting paper became louder at her words, students scrambling to take notes for something they were sure were going to be on their tests to get their license. Marco didn't move, sure of himself that he would remember the fact. Even if he didn't, and it cost him the chance of getting his hero license, it would be no stress to him. After their establishment was built in what would become modern-day Feotis district, the original founders welcomed those with the mutation with open arms. Unfortunately, not even a year into the Federation's Safe Haven's founding, Wendell retired and led a private life. Another picture flashed on the projector, showing a younger-looking Elizabeth in a nurse uniform. She stood among a group of army nurses, but she was the only one staring down the lens of the camera, as if to look at the viewer. The screen flickered to show another photo. It was a younger Thomas, dressed in his military uniform, sans cane, with his arm thrown around the shoulder of another soldier. He was smiling carefree, laughing proudly, and it was a shocking difference when looking at the picture of him and Elizabeth. He wondered if Thomas knew that when he was sent out into war zone, that he would come home changed, that he'd known that he would be labeled as some freak with a mutation instead of a hero. Thomas retired a few years after, and around the same time, the new abilities had shifted the economics of the city, resulting in districts that we know today, Symphony summarized. Feotis and Creo were well known for their progression in technology, Reed becoming responsible for the green spaces in the city, including farms, and Desher and Moores becoming the more domestic of the districts. While Symphony wasn't necessarily wrong about her assessment of each district, it felt too simple with how she chose her words. Feotis and Creo were known for the highest incomes due to their white-collar jobs and the heroes who lived among them. Reed was only slightly better off than the last two, focusing on agriculture the best that they could in the large city. Desher and the Moores scraped by, barely having enough money to keep their own economy going, as well as all their tax dollars went to funding the heroes, who did little to nothing to help them. He frowned when Symphony briefly looked over to where Marco sat at the back of the class, but if she could sense his displeasure, she didn't call him out on it. Once the original founders had retired, a new family took charge at the Federation, spreading it to the rest of the districts and rebranding the Safe Havens as a support group, she continued on, shifting 2 photos onto the projector. The first was a map of the city, littered with red dots all around the districts with a single star in Feodos. Each dot represented a new building of the Federation that was created in the absence of Wendell and Fellhart. The other photo was of a group of people standing side by side, professional smiles on their face that matched the office attire that they all wore. It was a mixed bag of people in the photograph, both men and women, old and young, and from the way some of them were dressed, it was clear they were from different districts, too. It wasn't hard to locate someone from the Moores when they dressed for a job that was typically outside of their home district, standing out with their 2 big blazers and 2 tight dress shoes. Symphony pointed to one person in particular, a young woman standing near the end of the line with dark skin and curly hair. The Ainsworth family invested into the idea of the Federation back before Thomas retired, and Cassandra led the charge in 1975 to make sure that the Federation's support was accessible to everyone, regardless of the district. Marco had to admit that the name wasn't one that he knew much about. He'd never really been interested in the early days of the Federation because of his own biases, and even if the Federation truly started out with good intentions, it clearly didn't end up with them. He could respect Cassandra Ainsworth if she wanted to help younger generations with their abilities that were still frowned upon, and her efforts in spreading the support group if that was her honest goal. Marco concluded that it must have been, watching as Symphony quickly moved on to the one topic that Marco had been dreading since he had walked into the history class. After what we know as the Great Fire of 75, caused by a young kid in the cinder track, the city still remained wary of those with any sort of abilities. This only began to change later in the 1990s, when Mayor Neil Coulson's son Alexander was abducted without a trace, leaving behind no ransom or clues to where he was being kept, she explained, showing a picture of their current mayor when he was a teenager. He looked happy, carefree in a way that Marco wondered how he turned into the corrupt politician that was in the Valiant Federation's pocket. After all, he was the one who worked with the heroes to outlaw vigilantes. While the police struggled with their investigation, a new group entered the scene to look for the mayor's son. Eric Roth, Gail Anil, Baylor Sowers, and Nyla Ismat were all standing together in front of City Hall, still kids then, as they all looked at Alexander. It was the scene that had been plastered into every history book that they've read since elementary school, and it was what many people widely considered the turning point for the city. The Federation support group had mostly been left to their own devices after the Great Fire, letting them exist in their own corners of the city without much jargon. No one protested against their existence anymore, but they were still a long way away from being fully accepted into society. The 4 of them were responsible for finding Alexander through their own investigations, and they were praised throughout the city for their bravery, Symphony retold, putting it simply. They were working in collaboration with Neil Coulson before the tragic accident that claimed his life, and with his blessing before he passed away, they were able to create the Valiant Federation with the help of Alexander. From there, the Federation evolved from a support group to the academy to help people understand their abilities. Another student raised their hand, and Symphony nodded to them. "Wasn't Baylor Sowers arrested recently?" they asked. For a moment, Marco could hear the hero's heart skip a beat in her chest, clearing her throat as she took a steadying breath. "We'll get to that," she placated, switching over to another photo. It was of an older Eric Roth, and on either side stood Gail Anil and Meredith Calloway. Instead of the traditional clothes that civilians wear, they were sporting the armored suits that every modern-day hero is gifted when they earn their license. Dual-toned metals covering over athletic material that protected them from physical hits. Some heroes, like Nexus, opted to wear some form of facial covering. But after the vigilantes became known for not being known, many of them just wore the armor. In the photo, Eric Roth's suit was a shiny bronze color, reflecting the flash of the camera off of the new metal. When he was dressed like that, he wasn't known as Eric Roth, but Calfaction, the Cinder Track hero. Gail Anil and Meredith Calloway wore the sky blue and deep purple respectively, accepting their personas as Jupiter and Nightshade. For 10 years, the Valiant Federation functioned solely as an academy that taught people how to use their abilities. This was where the founders created the power tracks that we still use today in our classes. A decade to the date of the Academy and Federation's founding, known as Valiant Day, it was announced to the districts that a deal was made between them and the local first responders to make a new branch, and that is how we came to have our superheroes. Along with the three in the photograph, Valkyrie was one of the original superheroes on the first team produced by the Federation. Just like before, when looking at the safe havens and the support groups, it was easy to say that they started out with good intentions, but they certainly didn't end with them, heroes included. There had been speculation for years that Eric Roth and his team were the first instances of corruption in the Federation. Even if they created superheroes to actually help the districts, no matter their neglect later in the years, there was still speculation about what happened to Neil Coulson that resulted in the grant that they received for the headquarters building, and additionally, what exactly was the accident that resulted in his death. There is no solid proof that Roth and his friends were involved in his death, but Marco was a naturally pessimistic person, so he had his doubts about the Federation's late leader. There have been many losses that affected the Federation and the civilians of the district greatly, facing the harsh reality of becoming the front line to protect the innocent. Like in 2022, Eric Roth was killed by a former vigilante who embraced true villainism, shocking the organization as a whole at the sudden loss of the leader who had been in charge for over 3 decades. Symphony continued, and Marco could hear the slight catch in her voice as her emotions choked her up. It unfortunately made sense even if he couldn't share the sentiment, knowing that Roth had been involved in Symphony's graduating class due to them containing the first group of vigilante students. Although there has been some questionable alliances made throughout the years, that hasn't stopped the Valiant Federation in the slightest from their fight against evil, she continued, and Marco couldn't ignore the sharp look that Symphony shot him, even if he tried. That answered his question on if Nexus told her that he was fisticuff. Speaking of the man, the final picture that she projected onto the screen was of Nathan Cuddy standing in front of City Hall, maskless for once. Back before he became the leader of the heroes, back when he was still on good terms with his vigilante friends like Eagle, he hardly wore the face mask unless out on a mission. In modern day, it was hard to catch the man in front of a camera at all, let alone showing his face. The picture was taken a couple of years ago, only a few weeks after the death of Roth was reported to the public. He was dressed in his hero suit of green metal and black athletic wear underneath, sharp eyes focusing on the mayor Alexander Coulson, as he was officially named head of the organization. Marco couldn't help but wonder if there was a small part of Nexus that missed being just Nathan Cuddy, or if he truly buried the name every time he put on the helmet. Nexus was elected to lead the Federation in the tragedy that was Eric Roth's death. Since then, heroes have been working on keeping all districts safe from the threat of those who use their abilities for harm, and taking new heroes under his wing as the Academy continues to grow and help all types of kids. At her words, Marco couldn't help but let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head at the obvious jab towards him. He could hear the near-silent sound of a laugh, and as he scanned the classroom, he met eyes with Linus. The other boy just shrugged smugly, fixing his attention back to the front of the room. That brings us to the first assignment you'll have this year, Symphony announced, turning off the projector as she addressed the class head-on. Starting simple, you'll be tasked to write a report about any topic relating to the Federation, spanning all the way back to the years of the original founders to the Nexus era of heroes. You'll have free reign over the project and total access to the historical documents saved in the headquarters library. It'll officially be due on Valiant Day. Marco let out an internal groan at the idea of having to do hours of research on anything related to the Federation. Besides the obvious, he also hated sitting and reading for long periods of time. It made him feel useless, along with restlessness, at the idea that he could be doing more. There was an instinctual guilt that took root in his chest beside his fear about not returning to the moors late last night to continue his work as fisticuff. He watched as the rest of his classmates slowly left the room for a brief free period, counting down the minutes until they could go to their training session with their track head. If Marco had been honest, he would have been working with the hero known as Canine, but since he wanted to keep his cards close to his chest, he'd be working with the strength track representative, Serpentine. Symphony watched him leave last, her bright blue eyes tracking him through the door with a barely restrained dislike. He could appreciate the fact that she hadn't tried to outright call him out during class, but it still made his skin crawl at any sort of attention from a hero. A brief flash of panic shot through him as he wondered if she knew. Did she somehow know that he was on the mine track floor last night, standing right outside of her dorm as he broke curfew? He'd take the fact that he was still standing, that she was none the wiser. If they catch you, they will kill you. Polly and her fellow nature track classmates all stood around a large mat that was in the center of the gym. Standing between Wyatt and Penny, they all waited in silence as their instructor was nowhere to be seen. Polly took the chance to look around the gym, trying to get a layout of the room that she'd spending most of her training classes in. It was a large gymnasium, one that rivaled her old school's, with bright fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling. Other than the larger mat they all stood around, there were smaller plastic mats around the rest of the room, set up for minor sparring. There were a few benches around the perimeter of the room, but other than that, the room was relatively empty. It made sense that they wouldn't want too many items scattered about if there were inexperienced students using their abilities in the fight for a first time. The nature track was unpredictable, which was a fact that everybody knew, and that there was no way to know if Polly was going to be sparring against someone who could control wind or summon rocks from the ground below. The conversations that were happening between the students were quickly brought to a screeching halt as the doors to the gymnasium were opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance by any means, just steady footsteps and confidence that every hero to some degree carried when it came to their job. Like it was nothing, the woman walked to the center of the blue vinyl mat and paused, scanning the class with sharp brown eyes. Nightshade, in the flesh, looked over each student, assessing them. She looked older than the TV screens had made her seem. While she was still fit for how old she was, a little over middle age, there were a few creases on her face that seemed to stand out against her dark skin under the fluorescent lights. It was rare to see her on the battlefield, but her muscles still appeared to be toned as she clasped her hands behind her back. She paced the perimeter of the mat with measured, careful steps, looking into the eyes of each of the students like it was a challenge. Polly didn't flinch when she met her gaze, staring back as if to tell the older hero that she was ready. "Today sets the baseline for your skills," she said after a moment, voice calm and calculated. "Based on how well your sparring matches go against your fellow classmates will determine your placement in this class, as well as your likelihood for the reward installed in this semester." The room once again broke out into excited whispers at the mention of an award for them to earn. Nightshade shut down the noise with a single raise of her hand, looking satisfied as the eagerness was silenced. "The students who perform the best in my class will get the opportunity to be assigned to an early mission with the highest rank heroes in the program," she stated simply, and an electric feeling spread throughout the students. Polly couldn't help but smile despite the dread that grew in her chest. Logically, she knew she didn't stand much of a chance against the other powers in the track, but there was no way that she wasn't going to try. Going on an early mission would give her a leg up that she desperately needed to become her own hero. Her mind already started racing for a contingency plan for how she was going to impress one of the longest-standing nature track heroes that the Federation had ever seen. "The rules to sparring are simple, but if you break them, I will send you out of class and see that you are expelled from the academy," she warned, a sharp look passing over every student to get her point across. When no one spoke, she continued. "Off of the mat is considered out of bounds. The moment you step off of it, you forfeit the match. The use of your abilities is allowed, and so is trying to injure your opponent with them or otherwise, but anything more than a bruise or scratch is an automatic fail. While you are fighting each other now, the people standing among you are your teammates, so treat each other as such." There was a harsh command in her voice that sent chills down Polly's spine. She could understand why villains would turn heel at the sight of the angry hero, feeling threatened even though she hadn't done anything wrong. "You two," Nightshade said, pointing to Blake and a girl standing opposite from him on the mat. "Start us off." Use what you know, and we'll build from there. Miss Nightshade, Blake began, usual confidence falling from his voice as he hesitated. Shouldn't we be matched up based off of our specific abilities? Will your opponent out in the city declare to you what abilities or weapons they have? Nightshade shot back, but her voice wasn't unkind. Blake stuttered with his words for a moment before settling on shaking his head, slowly making his way to the center of the mat. The other girl did the same, a toothy grin that read wrong even in Polly's eyes. She looked closer to someone who would be in the strength track, defined muscles and a healthy build. Her brunette hair was cut short, tucked behind her ears as she bounced from either of her feet to warm up. Blake nervously looked between her and Nightshade, stretching his own arm across his chest in preparation. Names and abilities, the hero asked the two students. Blake Gustav, Moss Manipulation, he introduced, getting a few poorly concealed chuckles from the others. Even though Polly wasn't the happiest with her roommate, she still felt bad for him. Drea Martin, Shapeshifting, the girl said with an air of confidence, smiling at the track leader. Polly furrowed her brows as she tried to decide what her words meant. When they called Nature Track the junk drawer of abilities, they meant it. When Drea used the word shapeshifting, it could mean a lot more than the surface-level definition of the word. From the way she seemed to command the energy on the mat, Polly could only assume that she could change her biology, similar to how Wyatt could do, and it wasn't the standard appearance shift, like her face or hair. Stand facing each other, wait for my count, Nightshade told them, stepping off of the mat so that the two could have the full space. The other students also took their own steps back, looking from a range of nervous to excited as they waited for their first match to begin. The hero counted them down, and when she spoke the last number, the energy in the gym shifted. Polly's assumption was right, watching as Drea's body contorted and changed, and left a grizzly bear standing in her place. She wasted no time trying to lunge for Blake, who looked just as shocked as the rest of the room. He was caught by the swipe of a massive paw, sending him sprawling to the side, rolling a few paces away from the edge of the mat. A few of the other students made noises of surprise, watching as Blake was almost eliminated on the first hit. Polly could feel her own body tense as she watched the bear change her position, pivoting to look at where Blake was lying. It was clear her roommate didn't plan to go down without a fight. With newfound energy, he sprung to his feet, jumping over the next swipe that Drea made with her paw, and managed to sidestep her counterattack. When he was able to get some distance from the bear, he took a visible deep breath, pressing the palms of his hands together, slowly separating them, and in the empty space that was there moments before was replaced with a string of moss, mimicking a rope. They all watched as he took a few more steps back, nearing the edge of the mat, and waited. Drea took another lunge at Blake, choosing blunt force over strategy, but was proven to be the wrong choice. Blake used a running start and managed to get his rope of moss messily wrapped around the front paw that she swiped at him, and using his agility in his smaller form, dashed between her and pulled. The bear became unbalanced for a moment, shifting its weight, but ultimately falling onto the shoulder of the trapped arm with a deep growl. Blake smiled brightly as he dropped the rope, taking a single step back from the bear. His celebration was short-lived as the gym watched as Drea used one of her hind legs to lash out, catching Blake in the gut as he was practically launched through the air, colliding harshly with the mat. He let out a few ragged breaths, and a few of the other students, Polly included, looked to Nightshade to see if the fight was over. She didn't react, eyes firmly trained on the two figures on the mat. Drea, clearly angry even while wearing an animal's face, stood on her back legs with a mighty growl. The sound startled Blake to try and rise to his own feet, still gasping for breath from being harshly winded. He managed to get himself to a crouching position on his knees, body tensing as Drea descended, claws swiping out towards him. He let out a sharp cry of pain as blood began to splatter onto the blue vinyl mat, seeping from the newest wounds on his shoulder. A few other students called out in concern. Others cheered for Drea on drawing the first blood of the training session. There was some whispering asking if the injury was even allowed, but Polly remained silent. Even though she was still upset with Blake from their earlier conversation for trying to tell her not to speak with Marco because he was an ultimatum, she still didn't want to see him get hurt. Her body jerked forward in instinct, the toes of her shoes making contact with the edge of the mat. Match. Winner, Nightshade declared calmly, motioning with her hands towards where Drea stood, now back to her human form. The girl beamed at the hero, nodding her head almost as if to tell her thanks, as she walked back to the opposite side of the mat where her own friends were waiting for her. Blake still remained on the ground, hand clutching at the claw marks that were left in his skin. No one seemed to make a move to help him up, not even Nightshade, so Polly made the decision for herself. She crossed the perimeter without a second thought, kneeling down next to Blake as she gently guided his hand away from his injured shoulder. She wasn't a medic by any means, but she did have some experience thanks to Marco. "You're going to be fine," she reassured automatically, scanning the scratches. "They don't seem too deep, but they might need some stitches." "On missions, you won't always be able to rely on your teammates to help you if you are critically injured," Nightshade called from the side of the gym. "Mr. Bermore, please escort Mr. Gustav to the medical. We'll continue on. Since you were so brave to interrupt their sparring match, you can be our first opponent." Polly blinked harshly for a moment before realizing that Nightshade was talking about her. She bit back her tongue to correct the teacher that she hadn't stepped onto the mat until the match was called, instead focusing on keeping her hand steady to help Blake sit up. She got a grateful smile once Wyatt joined them, helping the boys stand as they made their way slowly out of the gymnasium, a small trail of blood staining the path behind them. Worry gnawed at Polly's chest when the door shut resolutely, but she shook the thoughts from her mind. Blake would be in capable hands, and now she had bigger things to worry about. Nightshade pointed to a boy on the side of the mat, and he jogged to the position across from Polly. He brushed his sandy hair out of his face, shooting her a nervous smile as he waited for Nightshade's instruction. Polly normally would have mirrored the gesture, but the feeling of her friend's blood drying on her hand had made her mind a million miles away. "Names and abilities," the hero repeated, sharply drawing both of their attentions. "Garrett Carter, fine summoning and manipulation," the boy said, looking at Polly. She waited for a pause, clearing her throat before speaking. "Polly Everbright, pollen manipulation." Nightshade let out a hum from the sidelines. She could hear a few murmurs from the classmates around the mat. Pollen manipulation wasn't exactly an ability that many people had, let alone function the way that Polly's did. She carefully chose to keep that part about her powers to herself, hoping that her actions could speak for themselves first. She flexed her hands as Nightshade began her countdown, blood cooling onto her skin. She took a deep breath and nodded to Garrett as a silent way to wish him luck, and he returned the gesture with a grin. She bounced on the balls of her feet, but she didn't lunge for her opponent when Nightshade reached the final number. Instead, Polly took a step back, a sudden movement that made Garrett's vine that he had summoned stop just barely before reaching her. He had the green plant wrapped around his arm, using it like an extender, as he took a step forward to match the distance. Polly bit down a grin, seeing her plan being executed perfectly, planting her feet as Garrett reached out to her once more. When his vine shot out, she reached up and grabbed it with both of her hands, pulling it harshly. Garrett let out a noise of surprise as he stumbled forward. Polly quickly struck out her right leg, hoping to trip the boy out of bounds. He fell to the mat but managed to stay on top of it, as he quickly brought himself up to a crouching position. Unprepared, Polly felt one of his vines wrap around her ankle, pulling her off balance and rolling her to the other end of the mat. She tried to follow the movement of her body, keeping the momentum. Before Polly had known about Marco's vigilantism, he tried to subtly teach her how to fight properly. He had told her that it was because he wanted her to be prepared to join the academy, and that having a leg up in hand-to-hand combat would do her better in the long run. While she knew that his reasoning was a part of it, there was this underlying hope that she'd join him in his nightly escapades, an idea that she shot down immediately as soon as he even hinted at his true intentions. It wasn't the worst idea to know some self-defense while living in the moors, as unpredictable as the district was, so she still practiced the tips that Marco had given her. She always made sure to keep her thumb outside of her fist, to keep the momentum going, and to use her motion to her advantage whenever possible. She managed to roll herself into a crouching position to turn and keep her focus on Garrett. He had already recovered from his stumble, rising to his feet as he ran in Polly's direction. When he got close enough, Polly dove towards him, wrapping an arm around his waist as they both collided with the mat. Garrett tried to use 2 vines to wrap around her forearms, lifting her in the air for a moment, but she was able to twist her hand to get a hold of them. When her feet were on solid ground, she gave both the vines a solid tug, pulling him closer as she risked a punch in his direction. "Use your thumb to lock over your fingers," Marco had once told her, "and make sure that your knuckles are as flat as possible." She mimicked the position, ignoring the way that the dried blood split on her skin as she managed to clip the side of his cheek, Garrett letting out a grunt as he used his vines to push her away once more. She took the small victory in strides, standing near the edge of the mat as she waited for him to strike first. He recovered quickly, taking another charge at her. Instead of using the vines, he managed to lodge one of his legs behind her own, forcing her leg to bend as she fell back down onto the mat. She managed to roll from her knees onto her shoulder, moving swiftly out of the way as Garrett's hit collided with the ground. She managed to kick her leg out and hit his stomach as he crouched down, and she couldn't help but smile as she regained the upper hand once more. Her hopes of winning felt quickly dashed when she felt the pesky vine return once more and restrain her right hand. She flexed it under the hold, tugging it, but finding it incapacitated. She tried to throw out a weaker punch with her left, but Garrett quickly caught the hand by the wrist. She could see the proud look on his face as he was beginning to think that he had won, eyes briefly flickering from Polly's face to the edge of the mat that was so close by. She could almost read his mind as he formed his plan, and there was no world in which Polly was going to let herself get eliminated from her first sparring match because she got pushed out of bounds. She knew that she still had one trick up her sleeve, but it was the last option she wanted to choose if her main goal was to prove to not only Nightshade, but to her other classmates that she deserved to be at the academy. But if she didn't use her ability, she'd get knocked out, and any sense of respect that she had just gained would be forgotten. Along with her abilities, Polly had inherited a specific genetic trait called the photic sneeze reflex. In simple terms, if Polly looked at a bright enough light for long enough, she could trigger a sneeze. If she wanted to win her spar, she knew what she had to do, so she fixed her gaze on the bright fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling and hoped. She hoped that this would be the ticket to the top, not only winning her fight, but somehow making it onto the roster of students who could go on the early mission. She hoped that, at the very least, she caught the attention of Nightshade with something positive, and she hoped that her worst fears wouldn't come true. She at least had the decency to turn her head to the side so she wasn't directly sneezing on Garrett, letting out a quiet noise of the action. When she learned that her powers were tied to sneezing of all things, she taught herself quickly how to be near silent when doing it. Tufts of pollen were released from her fingertips, blowing directly into her opponent's face when he was distracted. He inhaled sharply, realizing his major mistake as he started coughing, rounding out with a few sneezes of his own as both of his grips loosened enough for Polly to break free. Hands free, she realized just how closely they had been standing to the edge of the mat. "This is your chance," a voice whispered in her head as she planted her feet once more. She silently apologized to Garrett for the cop-out move, giving a rough shove to both of his shoulders as he was still reeling from the effects of the pollen. He stumbled, feet tripping over themselves as he staggered backwards towards the edge. Relief washed over her as reality began to set in. She'd done it. She was able to win. In the blink of an eye, she watched as Garrett's body righted itself, jagged and sudden, blinking as he pitched forward, twisting his torso and letting his legs trip Polly. She fell forward harshly, knees cracking against the gymnasium floor as she was officially off of the mat, ending her match. Her bloodied hands curled into fists from where they held her up, head dropping with a heavy sigh. She was so close. "Match. Winner," Nightshade declared with the same finality that she had beforehand with Blake and Drea. Polly could only shake her head, disappointed in herself as she pushed up onto a standing position. She turned to face Garrett, to congratulate him despite her own discouragement that had begun to take root in her chest. But to her surprise, he was looking at Nightshade like she had grown a second head. "I didn't win," he said simply. "Polly did." A few murmured whispers of confusion rippled through the surrounding class of students, and Polly couldn't help but mimic them as she looked at Garrett, brows furrowed. He only shrugged as he walked towards her. "My buddy gave me a shove when you pushed me out of bounds. I left the mat fully, so you won," he explained simply, shooting a look to one of the boys that was standing behind Polly at the edge of the mat. He shot a glare at Garrett, shaking his head as he looked away from both his friend and the hero's gaze. "We do not tolerate cheating in this class," Nightshade told the boy, face neutral as she paced a step closer to the mat, motioning wordlessly for the boy to step onto it for the next match. He sighed heavily, but complied. "Good match," Garrett told her, holding out his hand so that they could shake on it. She almost did, but she stopped herself short at the sight of Blake's blood that was still smeared on her skin. She let out an awkward chuckle, dropping her hand when he also realized. "I'm sorry about your shirt," she replied instead, nodding to the stains that she left behind on his shoulders when she shoved him. He just waved her off, stepping off of the mat and rejoining his group of friends who consoled him after the loss. Polly met the eyes of Penny, who waved her over with a wide and proud smile on her face. "Good match, Miss Everbright," Nightshade called out, nodding at Polly when she whipped around at the sound of her voice. She couldn't even squeak out a response, feeling her face grow hot at the attention. Meekly nodding, Nightshade's attention slid off of her as she turned to face two new students on the mat. Penny squeezed her shoulders tightly as she whispered her congratulations, but Polly was almost in shock as she let out the smallest bit of pride bloom inside of her. When she walked into the gym, she was expecting a total failure of colossal size, but she was now greeted with the first win in their class. Instead of being ridiculed about how her abilities worked, she was able to prove firsthand that she could be useful, that she deserved her place at the academy. Marco was sitting in the headquarters library when Polly found him, rushing over to his corner and pressing her palms into the wood of the table that he was studying at. "You are looking at the first person to win their sparring match in their class," she told him, excitement barely contained into a whisper as she grinned widely. Marco blinked for a moment, trying to wrap his head around what she was saying to him. "That's... wow," he said as Polly sat down across from him. I know, but you could at least pretend to be excited for me first before you're shocked," she told him with the roll of her eyes. Marco shook his head with a fond smile, closing the history book that he was reading. He hadn't made much headway into it yet, the text being too large and the topic being too boring. "I am excited for you," he shot back, "and I'm very impressed. Seriously, well done." Polly smiled, a real smile, as she looked over the books that he had stacked beside him. In his free period between class and training, he decided not to follow the rest of his classmates, but to try and get a head start on the assigned project of research about the Federation's past. Marco had honestly tried to give it a go, to try and read about their history with an open mind, but there was something about it that hung heavy in his heart every time he read blatant biases that were covering the library. "So," Polly started, drawing out the syllable as she traced the edge of "the nurse" in Elizabeth Wendell biography. "What's with the research project?" You get to look forward to a long lecture of the Federation history, all the way back to its origins, and then get assigned a paper on one of the eras that's due on Valiant Day. She groaned dramatically, pressing her forehead onto the table with a sigh. While Polly wasn't the biggest fan of schoolwork in typical classrooms, it was made even worse that she'd be sitting through a lesson that was something she knew like the back of her hand. He sympathized with her, patting her shoulder in condolences. "What era have you decided on? Maybe we can do the same one and help each other," she reasoned, noting how no two books on the table covered the same topic. It was Marco's turn to sigh as he let out a nervous laugh, running his hands through his hair. "That's the funny thing," he started. "I haven't decided on one." "Always the procrastinator," she teased, shaking her head in mock scolding. It felt nice to flow into something more natural after their stinted conversation that morning, even though Marco knew it mostly was his fault it had been awkward anyway. He could hardly bite his tongue before he made a joke about doing his research over the Eagles Federation days. Polly would roll with the punches, and she let out a small laugh as she shook her head fondly, but deep down they both knew that any excitement she felt about her training would immediately be diminished if he brought up the vigilante. It would just serve as another reminder of their divide, and how Marco would never truly be excited about any of Polly's achievements if they were tied to the Federation. "How was the rest of training?" he landed on asking, feeling that it was a safe conversation topic. He was merely proven right as he watched her green eyes light up as she leaned in closer on the table. "Even though I won my match by the skin of my teeth, it was still great," she told him. "My roommate got injured, though, so I'll have to stop by the infirmary before I head to class." A frown pulled at Marco's lips. How badly injured? Enough where he'll definitely be coming back with a few stitches, Polly said with a grimace. There was an unreadable look on her face as she looked everywhere but Marco, hands pressed firmly into the sleeve of her sweater as she fidgeted. Normally he would have prodded for more information because Polly always seemed to hand it over every time he asked, but he couldn't help but feel that her reaction had something to do with Marco himself. With a tight nod, he let it go. And what about you? He settled on. Any injuries? A few bumps and bruises, but nothing I can't handle, she brushed off, waving a hand through the air. Marco could feel himself relax ever so slightly at the reassurance. Oh, I can't believe I almost forgot to tell you the most exciting part, she began, earning a few glares around the library from the sudden noise. There's a competition in the classes that whichever students do the best get to go on an early assignment with a few heroes. He couldn't help but let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head despite the way Polly frowned, the spark of excitement that she had felt being diminished in seconds. So the Federation uses the excuse of bringing in young vigilantes to the academy because they can't be trusted on the streets. But they're going to send out students of the exact same age to do the exact same thing, he summarized, a hot coal of anger simmering in his sternum. That's not the same thing at all, she scolded with a roll of her eyes. The students are going to have experienced heroes with them as guides. It's not like they're just letting us go loose to do whatever we want. And that makes it better? I'm not having this conversation right now, Polly said. Marco felt a cold bolt of surprise zip down his spine. He'd always known that she wasn't the biggest supporter of vigilantes, but she never outright shut the conversation down when Marco spoke about it, like it was a part of their unspoken agreement. Polly could talk about the heroes she looked up to growing up, and Marco could talk about the vigilantes in turn, and neither of them were required to comment on the other's topic. Why not? He asked in genuine curiosity, but his tone clearly didn't translate alongside his thoughts, as Polly's face fell into one of true anger. She let out a long sigh as she leaned forward, dropping her voice low so that the other students at the tables around them couldn't hear. Do you know what the other students call you? She asked. Marco could guess, but he shook his head anyway. They call you an ultimatum student. The words rang in his head as he digested them, thinking back to that night. He tried not to think of the deeper implications, even after his conversation with the janitor, but he knew that he couldn't avoid the thought forever. I don't deal in ultimatums. Well, now you do. Choose. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair as he looked at Polly. Who cares what they call me? That's never bothered you before, he said, almost in a challenge. He watched as she stared at him for a moment, the gears turning in her head as she squinted, studying his face. It matters to me now, she began slowly, cautiously choosing her words, because you're keeping secrets from me. I'm not, he tried to insist, but the words themselves felt like ash on his tongue. In his mind, he wasn't lying to Polly, just hiding a few key details to keep her safe. He was sure that she'd disagree, but he'd take an angry Polly over a dead one any day. If that meant lying by omission to keep it that way, then he'd gladly do it for the rest of their days. Why did you apply to the academy? She asked, leaning back in her chair with her arms held wide. When did you talk to Nexus to tell him that you were in the strength track, and why? He stumbled over his words for a moment, finding nothing that he could use to explain to her why he'd done what he did. He also couldn't risk another loyal student, or even worse, another hero, overhearing him tell Polly the truth. He glanced around the rest of the library to search for any prying eyes, and instead of finding an eavesdropper, he was met with his friend's heavy sigh. If this is about you trying to protect me, you don't have to. If today's class says anything, it just means that maybe you've been underestimating me, she told him, looking more defeated than anything. Marco reached up to rub at his temples, a headache slowly bleeding in. Taking down a student who didn't know how to throw a proper punch is hardly proving you can protect yourself, he said without thinking much of it. It was only when her face twisted into one of pure offense did he realize just how his words came across. He had meant that fighting against one student and winning was hardly a way to measure success when she was looking at a career of going to war against those with as much experience as her whole lifespan, and he would have told that to anyone else who had asked. Polly didn't seem to share the same sentiment, letting out a scoff. I've got to get ready for class. "Come talk to me when you want to tell me the truth," was all she said, rising from her seat with a frown. He felt a bolt of panic shoot through his chest at her words, but he felt frozen to his chair as he helplessly watched her walk away. "Polly," he called out, but even though he knew that she could still hear his volume, she didn't turn around. He listened to her footsteps retreat until the doors of the library shut again. There were no words to describe his emotions other than defeat, slumping in his chair and pressing his forehead against the table. He was proud of Polly, and he did have faith in her, but there was no way that she'd believe him after their conversation. It felt like he was back to square one, like a repeat of their failed conversation from that morning. Actually, he felt worse, because at least Polly had actively seeked him out afterwards. Marco had a feeling that he wasn't going to get that mercy again until he came clean about everything. It wasn't like he didn't want to, because Polly was the only person he could say that he 100% completely trusted with his entire heart. Much like himself, Polly was loyal to a T, and if he told her about his fears about the heroes, about what the janitor had told him the other night, she'd stand beside him with no questions asked, because that's just who she was. Marco couldn't help the small whisper formed in the darkest part of his mind that asked, but would she? She had only been at the academy for a day, and she was already shining more brightly than any day that she had spent in the moors with Marco. She was clearly making new friends in her class and dorm, and she was thriving in her training just like she'd always dreamed of doing. It made Marco wonder in a cynical spiral if his secrecy came from wanting to protect Polly from his own faults and fears, or if it was just a way to keep her close. If Marco had something that Polly didn't know about, they'd both knew that she'd follow him anywhere to get the answers she wanted. He couldn't help but ask himself if he was making this mess for himself as a way to try and keep Polly from not needing him. But even if that was the case, the janitor's words still meant something. He pried himself away from the library table, bones popping from their long time of no use, and slowly made his way out of the room. His mind felt like it was melting out of his ears from his hour of pointless research, and the only thing he could clearly think about was heading back to his dorm for a nap. He could only hope that his room was empty, because the last thing he wanted to deal with was one of his classmates, especially the Brandstone. Of course, his luck always came in abundance. "You look like hell warmed over," Linus's voice greeted him, a sharp edge to his words as he stood near the ladder to his own bed. In his hand was one of the backpacks that were previously stacked up on the desks between the two bunks, and Marco could see that the way his muscles and his hands gripped it tightly. "Thanks," he replied flatly, turning to sit on the edge of the bottom bunk he had claimed the other night. Linus frowned, but even Marco knew it wasn't because of his response, or lack thereof. Instead, the boy's eyes flickered from Marco's face to the bag he was holding, and then back to Marco. Like Marco was going to leap up at any moment so that he could try and steal it from him. "Wow, Brandstone, here I thought we were becoming friends," he huffed out, sarcasm thick. He had already had a bad day, so the last thing he truly wanted was to deal with Linus and his classism against him. "Well, you know what they say," Linus began with a shrug. "Never trust someone from the Valley of Death." "Is that all you know how to say? Never trust someone from the Valley of Death?" he mocked, folding his arms as he rose from his bed and stepped closer to Linus. Blonde shook his head with a huff of irritation, rolling his sky-blue eyes as he turned to the bag laying on his bed. His hands hesitated for a moment before opening the backpack, cautiously aware of Marco tracking his movements. He listened to Linus shuffle through the bag's content, knowing the faint rattle of metal hitting against itself, before he harshly zipped the bag closed, turning his attention back towards Marco with a scowl. "I say it because it's true. You can cry and whine because you were raised in the poorest district, but we both know that if you wanted out, you would have left," Linus snarled, pointing at Marco's chest with the pencil he just retrieved. His face was colored with an angry red, brows drawn in a glare as he stood a foot away. He waited for Marco to respond, and waited for him to take the bait. But he only stared back at the teen from the Fiotis district, adding his words to the long list of insults others had shouted at him. He let the silent challenge hang between them, only to be interrupted by a knock on the dorm room door. Linus broke away with a few muttered swears and opened it to reveal Levi. "Is everything okay in here?" he questioned, looking between the two once he registered the tension. Marco made no attempt to respond, not looking away from Linus. The blonde sighed, running a hand through his hair as he nodded to his friend, pushing his way out of the room and down the hall. Marco listened to his footsteps fade, giving a single nod to Levi's confused look. "You can't save the day all the time," he said, watching the minuscule twitch of a frown pull at Levi's face. He masked it well, glancing behind him where Linus disappeared. "If you both plan to make it to graduation, you two have to learn to tolerate each other," he said sternly. It was what Marco learned to call his leader voice, and it had already become his least favorite thing about the young adult. Instead of snapping back about how he didn't want to be at the academy in the first place, he bit his tongue and relaxed into his own bunk, ready to forget the last hour of his life had ever happened. Levi said nothing, quietly sighing before turning on his heels to follow his friend. Marco listened to Levi walk down the hall, muttering to himself about what to do to fix the situation between him and Linus. He waited until the words became muted, overtaken by the general noise around the headquarters. He distantly wondered where Polly ended up after their fight. He knew that's what it was, but calling it a fight felt too harsh, too real. Thinking about going to look for her, Marco decided against it, realizing that she was probably spending time with her roommates who actually liked her, unlike Marco's. He shut down the bitter thoughts by rubbing a hand across his face, pushing himself up into a sitting position as his eyes landed on Linus's bag that was still sat atop of his bed. Just from the stitching and the material alone, Marco could tell the backpack was expensive. It was probably worth more than his entire wardrobe combined. He was sure that the designer had some fancy, hard-to-pronounce name, but Marco couldn't find it within himself to care too much about it. If Linus was going to insist that no one could trust him, or anyone else from the moors, then he decided there was no point in trying to prove him wrong. Despite being the only one in the dorm room, Marco moved at the same stealth he would when he patrolled his fisticuff. He tuned in to the noise in the hallway that passed by the room as he began to search through the bag's contents. He found nothing too interesting at first, shuffling past notebooks, pens, and even a jacket that was crammed in without care. Linus without a doubt would notice the clothing article missing, so Marco continued his search for something smaller. He found his mark as a thin metal chain, glinting in the fluorescent light. It looked like something that could be bought at any store in any district, but that made it all the more tempting to take. The weight was light in his palm, and wouldn't be easily noticed if it went missing. In Marco's opinion, it could have easily slipped out of the bag without the owner being able to feel. Marco quickly tucked the chain away in his pocket, listening to the fading footsteps of a stranger that walked past the door. Taking a breath, he stuffed the remainder of Linus's items back how he found them, nodding to himself as he was satisfied with the cover. While he did find guilt ebbing at his conscience, he decided to ignore it. After all, it wasn't his fault that no one could trust anyone from the Valley of Death. Taking down a student who didn't know how to throw a proper punch is hardly proving you can protect yourself. Polly scoffed under her breath as she replayed the conversation over and over in her mind. She loved Marco, unlike anyone else in her life, but that only meant that he was the only person who could make her as mad as she was. She understood his perspective, always giving him the benefit of the doubt when it came to the Federation. But for once, she wished her friend could share her victory with her without somehow tearing down her confidence into something small and unworthy. She thought they were past that. She remembered the day clearly in her mind, taking place after that one bad fight about Marco keeping things from Polly that ended in tears. When they were younger, maybe a year or two ago, they were out in the moors running errands together. It was a rare time where they had both been working odd jobs, so their schedules hardly aligned back then, but that one day seemed like fate where neither of them had to go to work. Unfortunately for them, their cupboards had gone bare, and most of their food in the fridge were threatening to spoil. So they quickly determined that their day off should be spent trying to make sure they wouldn't starve in the following week. Polly never minded running errands, but she always loved doing it with Marco. They found a way to make it fun, and it was nice to have a time where they could just exist together and talk. Marco never showed any signs of disagreeing, so they bounced from store to store to grab whatever food items they needed for their planned meals. She could clearly remember how they reached the end of their grocery list when Marco recalled that they were running dangerously low on a candy that Polly liked. She didn't have the heart to correct him that it was actually his favorite candy, and she only liked to snack on it so that he'd have a reason to buy it. If he knew that he was the only one who liked it, there was no way Marco would waste money on it. His words, not Polly's. They stopped at the convenience store that was on the way back to their apartment, and they did what they always did. Marco led them to the appropriate aisle, and they joked around about anything that came to mind, just enjoying the time together like they had all day. Until a masked man burst through the door with a pistol aimed high, shooting a warning shot into the ceiling. Naturally, everyone in the store ducked, cowering with fear as the robber herded them towards the front, where the clerk watched with his hands up. They all watched as the robber pointed his gun at the old man, demanding all of the money in the register. Polly could pinpoint the exact moment the boy sitting beside her was no longer Marco, but the infamous fisticuff. His eyes glazed over into something calculating, hands twitching into fists as he tried to rise into a crouched position to try and get the jump on the man. 1,000 visions flashed through her mind of all the ways that could go wrong, reaching a hand out to grab his wrist to keep him in place. The way he startled would be seared in her mind. The same way that the look the robber shot the two of them when he whirled around at the noise would be too. Marco's old and cracked phone tumbled out of his pocket when Polly reached out to him, clattering to the floor noisily that alerted the robber. She watched in real time as he looked between Marco and the phone, obviously thinking that he was trying to call the police or something smart, not ever guessing that Marco was going to try and jump him himself. At lightning speed, the robber reached out and grabbed the closest hostage, a sobbing little girl who was sitting next to her mother, as he began to shout threats to Marco. It was something about how if Marco had even powered on his phone, things were going to get messy quick, but Polly couldn't remember verbatim. Instead, she was focused on the scared little girl, and how all the robber's attention was firmly fixed on Marco beside her. She knew that it would be safer to let the police deal with the man, to negotiate him away from harming any of them, but she strained her ears over the yelling of threats to hear no sirens, no help approaching at all. Even if on the rare chance a hero was close enough to deal with the problem, they were typically focused on higher-risk missions. Even now, Polly still wondered how a little girl with a gun to her temple wouldn't qualify as high risk. Maybe it was stupid, maybe it was brave, or some mix in between the two, but Polly saw an opening that screamed opportunity. She still had dreams about the feeling of slowly shuffling over the hard tiled floor of the store until she was next to the mother of the little girl, looking at the robber's masked profile as he still screamed at Marco. She could recall how Marco tried to talk the man down from doing anything rash, keeping his own voice even, holding his hands up in surrender as if he had done it 1,000,000 times before. When she saw her opportunity, Polly rose to her feet slowly, looking up to the lights as she focused all of her attention to her abilities. When she could feel the building sneeze, no longer embarrassed because she knew what she was doing, she stood to her full height, letting pollen explode in a small burst by the man's face. The mask prevented him from inhaling most of it, but that didn't stop the yellow powder from blinding him temporarily. She took the moment to reach for the little girl, tugging her by the arm harshly to break her free from the man's grasp. She knew it was stupidly risky, but it wasn't like she was alone in her plan. Marco had a tendency to read her mind, or at least know how to play along with her ideas without needing to be told what they were. When Polly pulled the girl close to her body, wedging her between her and the girl's mother, using her own body as a shield, Marco acted. He dove for the robber while he was still incapacitated, landing a few good hits on the man until he fell. Polly watched as he disarmed the gun, unloading it, tossing the ammunition far away from any reach the man could have. They had a long conversation that night about what Polly had done, and at the time she gleefully got Marco to admit that she could defend herself better than he had originally thought. Not only did she prove to Marco, vigilante extraordinaire, that she wasn't just something fragile, but she proved to herself that her dreams of being a hero weren't so much as a fantasy as she once thought. It only made the question in her head more confusing as to why it felt like her and Marco were now on a downhill slide from where they started. "Miss Everbright?" a voice called, drawing Polly out of her trance with a harsh blink. She found herself staring at one of the bulletin boards outside of the gym, looking at some motivational poster with Serpentine posing on it with her muscles flexed. She looked to her left to find Nightshade. Immediately she straightened up, eyes falling to the floor in embarrassment, even though she didn't know why. She stumbled through an awkward greeting, watching as the hero stepped closer to her. When Polly lapsed into silence, the woman cleared her throat. "I was quite impressed with your match today," she told her, voice not giving anything away. Polly couldn't help the burst of pride in her chest as she smiled, shifting her weight between her feet. "That's quite the compliment from you," she said. "Thank you." "Your abilities are unique," Nightshade continued, looking at Polly as if she was studying her. She let the words hang empty in the air, and Polly couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh. "As lame as they are, I was hoping they'd give me an advantage here," she said as she looked away from the hero. "Uniqueness demands attention, and all that." To Polly's delight, Nightshade hummed in agreement, nodding along to her words. It felt like a weight was lifted off of her chest as she watched Nightshade smile softly. "I know what you mean," was all that she said, looking amused. Never would Polly have guessed that she'd be in the exact position that she was, but she could only feel overjoyed, standing next to her literal childhood hero. "I'm looking forward to tomorrow's training," Polly tacked on, because she just couldn't help herself. Maybe with a little less blood next time, though. At that, Nightshade said nothing, and the sinking feeling in Polly's gut returned at full force as she watched the woman's face harden, fully facing Polly. She clasped her hands behind her back, looking every bit the hero that she was, as she analyzed Polly one last time. "Blood is a part of this field as much as the training," she told her. Words not stern, but professional. Polly could only nod once, subconsciously running her palms down the front of her pants. She knew that it was the truth as much as she hated it, but she understood what she meant. Occupational hazards. "I think there's a hero to be made out of you, Miss Everbright," Nightshade declared, like it wasn't everything Polly wanted to hear and more. "Thank you, Nightshade," she began, but was cut off when the older woman raised her hand to silence her. "I do not make this offer very often, and let alone make it lightly, so please consider what I'm about to say to you," Nightshade continued on, looking at Polly with sharp eyes. "I think under the right coaching, you can be something greater than you are now. I'd like to offer you additional training to accompany your academy schedule." Polly had to bite at her tongue for 2 reasons. She was convinced that she was dreaming, that the entire day had been some figment of her imagination that was going to be interrupted by her alarm clock at any moment. She also had to physically stop herself from speaking, because if she hadn't, she was sure she would have answered Nightshade immediately, despite the woman's request to consider it. "Thank you so much," she said after a moment, breathless. "I'll think about it." "Let me know by next class," was the hero's response, nodding to Polly as she made her way down the hallway and turned out of sight. Polly couldn't help the squeal of excitement that left her lips, pumping a fist in the air as soon as she was alone. She respected Nightshade the absolute most out of every hero within the headquarters, so there was no chance that she'd pass up on the opportunity to personally train under her, to become her protégé. It was something that Polly could only imagine happening to her, and now it was. Polly Everbright came to the Federation as the joke, the odd man out. Polly Everbright was going to be personally trained by Nightshade.